So, good evening, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us this evening for another Restless event with our partners, My Menopause Centre. And this evening, we're looking at managing weight gain and gut health in the menopause transition. So, before I hand over to Helen, who's going to chair this evening's event, I just want to remind you to post your questions and thoughts in the chat function at the bottom of your screens, and feel free to post throughout the presentation, and there'll also be time at the end for questions. So the event will run for an hour and we are recording it, so we will mail it to everyone who's registered. So I'll hand over now to Helen, who's panel chair and who is the co-founder of My Menopause Centre. Over to you, Helen.
Hi, thanks very much, Aideen, and good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We know we're in stiff competition with the sun for those of us that live in the UK. Hopefully the sun is shining in Ireland as well this evening. And what would be lovely is if you could just pop in the chat and say where you're dialing in from. What we found as we do these sessions is we have people from all over the UK and Ireland, but also the States and Europe joining in as well. Yes, Wiltshire, sunny 5. New York City, welcome. I imagine it's quite hot, Martha, in New York at the moment, Somerset. So it's always South Africa. Wow. So we really are covering both hemispheres and multiple continents. So one of the things I really love is how with what we're doing here, we're really bringing together a global community of women to talk about issues that we share, things that we're struggling with. And we've got two brilliant experts joining us this evening to talk about weight management, nutrition, and gut health in the menopause. So as you will have seen in the invite to this evening's event, you know, I've heard so often, if I got a penny, not to mind a pound, for every time I've heard somebody say I've gained weight, even though my eating hasn't changed, I too would have an island like Richard Branson somewhere in the Caribbean or wherever his island is. It's so common and we all really, really struggle with it, in particular as we hit our 40s and 50s. So if this is you, you're not alone. Menopause weight gain is incredibly common and it can leave us feeling so frustrated and confused. It's easy to blame ourselves thinking that we lack the willpower or that everyone else has figured it out. But the truth is, it really isn't your fault. Menopause increases the likelihood of weight gain for many reasons. And we have two fantastic experts here this evening to talk to us about menopause, weight gain, and gut health. And we're going to cover a wide range of assets. And as ever, please feel free to put your questions into the chat. Obviously, our experts can't answer individual questions because they don't have your medical history, but we can speak about things and answer questions in a more general level. So we're joined by Dr. Anna Greaves. Dr. Anna is a registered menopause specialist in NHSGP, and it's our good fortune that she works with us at My Menopause Centre, and we're delighted to have her and honoured to have her as part of the team. Anna graduated from the University of Birmingham in 2008 and is a diplomat of the Faculty of Sexual and Reproductive Health and the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. She has been a GP for over 10 years and has always had an interest in women's health. While working as a GP, Anna saw that there was an unmet need to support women struggling with the perimenopause and menopause, and seeing the vast range of physical and mental impacts and hearing the stories of so many women, it inspired her to undertake the advanced menopause training with the British Menopause Society. As well as her work with My Menopause Centre, Dr. Anna also works in an NHS menopause clinic, and she has a particular interest in gut health and is really knowledgeable in this. And I've learned so much from her on it and how it impacts our physical and mental well-being. And I can't wait to hear what she has to say again this evening. Now, we're also got the good fortune to be joined by nutrition expert Claire Grace. Claire did an event with us in January and is back by popular demand. She's a registered dietitian and nutritionist with over 30 years of experience and founder of Second Spring Nutrition. Claire specialises in weight management and diabetes remission, and she really brings a wealth of expertise in how nutrition can affect our health during the menopause transition. Claire offers practical, evidence-based approaches that really make a difference over the years, and she has guided thousands of women in transforming their eating habits and overall health by blending proven nutrition strategies with an understanding of the psychology of eating. And her insights in particular into the psychology of eating are so important and will explain a lot around faddy diets and why it can be so hard to form new habits. But she's got great advice on what you can do about that. So we're going to kick off with one of the key questions, which is around why weight gain is so common in the menopause. And Anna, we'll start with a question for you. So maybe if you could just help us to understand how the hormone changes that we experience in the menopause transition impact our overall well-being.
Absolutely, and thank you for the lovely introduction, Helen. So in the menopause transition, we have a change in several hormones. We have a change in testosterone and progesterone, but we also have significant changes in our estrogen, and that's what really tends to drive most of the changes in our well-being. So as our estrogen levels fall, we have a host of symptoms. Physical ones are ones that often people have heard of. So hot flushes and night sweats tend to be the most common ones people have heard of, but we also have other physical symptoms such as headaches, palpitations, dry skin and hair, aches and pains. On top of that, we have some mental health changes. So physiological changes in the brain are really driving, so that estrogen drop there is driving real physiological changes, which can result in changes in mood that can be quite diverse. So women can find that they feel more anxious, they can feel low, they can also feel much more rage, they can feel much more irritability. So a host of sort of emotional and mental health symptoms. And then we have cognitive symptoms too. So women can find that they suddenly have more issues with focus, with concentration, motivation, memory issues. People often describe it overall as brain fog. Word finding difficulties is a very specific one which women commonly mention. And kind of overall, that unsurprisingly can result in a real drop in self-esteem and confidence. And then another aspect of things is changes in symptoms that can affect our sex lives. So reduction in libido, and then vaginal dryness, soreness, and bladder symptoms too. So there really is quite a vast array of symptoms. And what I think that shows us is how ubiquitous estrogen receptors are within our bodies. This isn't simply to do with our periods at all. This is really affecting almost every system within our body.
Very comprehensive overview, Anna, and I've just posted a link into the chat, which links to our free symptom checker, where we look at over 40 symptoms of menopause, and for each individual symptom, Dr. Claire has written some great advice on how to manage that. But Anna, one of the things that happens then, and you can see how the conflation of some of these symptoms can lead to changes in eating habits. If you know, when you're tired and you're stressed, it's easier to reach for a biscuit or a piece of chocolate or a glass of wine to manage all of these things. So Claire, when you look at the women that come to you in your clinic, given everything that Anna's just explained about how the hormones are impacting all of these changes in our body, and it's different for every woman, what do you tend to see in women who are going through perimenopause and postmenopause when they come into your clinic?
In terms of
things that are driving weight gain and how the symptoms can impact in that way.
Yeah, so I think one of the, and I've just seen someone put it in the comments actually, one of the really common things that we see is increase in sugar cravings and hunger in general. And that can be to do with the declining estrogen levels, but also can be affected by our gut health as well. So definitely hunger and appetite changes. Also, what we see as we're going through menopause is that we start to lose muscle tissue. So we'll lose about 1 to 2% of our muscle as we're aging each year, unless we do something to try and prevent and reverse that. And muscle, and not just the quantity, but the health of the muscle that we've got, is really important when we're thinking about managing weight. Because the more muscle you've got, the higher your metabolic rate, and therefore the more calories you're going to be burning off. But also, our muscle acts like a sort of sponge in a sense, and it will take sugar out of the blood and into the muscle where it needs to be used. So the more efficient your muscle is at doing that, the better. And I think, like you said, emotional eating for some women is really relevant at this time. This period of life, there's a lot thrown at us, and we can be tired and stressed, and it's not surprising that we kind of turn to food maybe to cope with how we feel. And you know, I think that sometimes, you know, this is a key thing for us to look at, is that kind of emotional eating element of it.
And then all of the things that you've called out, you know, really point to some of the key, you know, biological changes that are happening in our body. And, you know, knowledge really is empowering. So in the first instance, I suppose, being aware of these things that are happening makes it more understandable, not necessarily welcome, but understandable in terms of what's going on. But before we go into gut health, Anna, just a question to you both. You know, there's a lot of focus on managing, getting to a healthy weight. Just why is it so important if we are obese or overweight? Why is it so important to get back into a healthy weight range? What are the implications of carrying too much weight?
So I think, you know, one thing that when we do gain weight in the perimenopause and menopause, one thing that's slightly different to when we're gaining weight maybe in our 20s and 30s is where we're putting that weight. So when we, on average, women will gain about 1.5 kilos per year in their perimenopausal stage, and that generally tends to equate on average to about a 10 kilo weight gain by the time women go through the menopause, that 12 months since their last period. And what we're tending to do is put most of that weight in that apple distribution around our upper abdomen, and really most of that isn't actually being laid down subcutaneously, that stuff that you can grab with your hands, even though that's what a lot of women don't like sort of aesthetically. What we're actually doing is we're laying that down viscerally, so that's within the organs. And that the difference with that is that it's very metabolically active, so it's actually doing a lot. It's not just sitting there making you sort of feel heavier or you know, feeling like it's affecting the way that you're looking. It's actually releasing lots of chemicals and hormones that are driving inflammation. They're called adipokines, and they are actually metabolically very active. So they are driving your insulin resistance increasing, which means that you're then you're more prone to, so your blood sugars are less well controlled, you're more likely to get diabetes. It's also driving up your cholesterol, your blood pressure, and it's also driving a lot of inflammation. So we know that there are 22 cancers related to obesity, and actually a lot of the link that we're putting together between obesity and cancers is through these adipokines, through this inflammation driven by these chemicals. So it's setting off lots of different pathways in our body that are driving processes that are unhealthy. So it's also driving what we call atherosclerosis, which is the laying down of plaques and cholesterol deposits in our arteries and vessels. So it's making us more prone to have heart disease, to have strokes and other sort of vascular issues. So we know that there is a huge number of negative health impacts from obesity. In general, there's obviously also physical, so women who are carrying more weight are more likely to have arthritis, aches and pains, be less able to exercise in the way that they would wish to. They're more likely to have sleep disruption, potentially have sleep apnea. There are you know, lots of health impacts in both mental health in terms of maybe self-esteem and confidence, but also then in a very well researched medical way. So there's really quite a lot of things, but this distribution of fat is a really important component of that, which is why actually we need to think about BMI, that way of measuring weight in terms of compared with your height, but also the waist, you know, measuring your waist very specifically in relation to your height is really important, because that's really giving us a feel of how much weight we're carrying really in this central distribution around in our organs. And that is very, very different to a woman who's always carried a lot of weight around her buttocks or hips, which is a much healthier distribution of fat.
Yeah, look, Anna, that's really, thank you for that explanation, that summary. It just really underscores the importance of weight management and getting to that healthy weight, and the other myriad of benefits that come from that as we think about, you know, we're living longer, but it's really about the quality of life that we have. So it's health span as well as lifespan. Claire, we're getting lots of comments in the chat. You'll see around, you know, my menopause tummies, as somebody has called it out here. The comment that we said at the top, I'm eating the same and I'm still gaining weight, and Anna has touched on one of the reasons why. 1.5 kilos a year over 10 years, that's quite a lot, you know, if it just happens attritionally. Any thoughts yourself, Claire, on, you know, how we think about insulin resistance, how we think about how we think about inflammation and cortisol?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of this is the understanding that as we are reaching menopause, our body is really processing foods and responding to foods in a different way. And it's like Anna was saying, that is linked in with this insulin resistance, our body not processing the sugars as well as what it used to do. So, you know, I think that is because of that, we need to be changing our eating in response to that, and changing our focus in terms of activity as well. And I think that you were talking there about healthy weights, and I think a really important point to mention is that from a health point of view, it isn't necessary to really get down to healthy weights unless that's something that you can do, but it isn't necessary. If you can lose fairly modest amounts of weight, somewhere between 5 and 7% of our weight will lead to a 50% reduction in insulin resistance. And if someone has been told that they have prediabetes, that magnitude of weight change can shift them from that prediabetes back into a normal blood sugar range. So I think it's really important that we don't undervalue modest weight loss, because actually from a health perspective, it can have a really important impact.
Yeah, no, and that's a great point, Claire. I'm just going to come back to some of the things that you both said. Anna, starting with you, a great question here around if you could just explain again the link between waist size and height.
Absolutely. So if you measure around your waist, then we would ideally like the ratio between your waist and your height to be under 0.5. And that's just a very good way of looking specifically at where you've put that weight. So if, you know, like I say, everyone has a different body shape, and if someone has always had more weight around their buttocks and hips, then that isn't necessarily as big an issue as someone who's a very sort of clear apple shape. So we look at BMI and it's useful, but for people, especially with a BMI of 35 or more, I think we have largely enough information to say that there's an issue with weight. But for women who have a BMI of under 35, that can be a very useful additional measurement, just to show us how much is really deposited centrally, and therefore as a sort of a surrogate marker of how much visceral fat there is, because that's what we really feel is that danger distribution.
So it's an additional data point that
Yeah.
can help you better understand if there's something for you to think about and to work on. And Claire, we've had lots of great questions in here around what we can do to shift weight from our tummy, and we'll come to that in a moment. But before we do, maybe if we spend a moment on gut health, the importance of gut health and how it's impacted by the menopause. So Dr. Anne, as you and I have discussed before, you know, a few years ago, no one was really talking about the gut or gut health and the gut microbiome. And now it seems to be you can hardly pick up the newspaper or a magazine without reading something about it. So could you maybe just start with the basics to help us to understand what is our gut microbiome and why it matters, why the health of our gut microbiome matters?
Absolutely. So our gut microbiome is this community of organisms within our guts. It's bacteria and yeasts and viruses and a multitude of different organisms in there. And they are all doing various different activities within there and interacting with each other. And we've always known that they're there, but we almost used to think of them as simply being sort of passive, passengers really within our guts. And then I think science has really moved on and escalated to a point where we've been able to actually measure that relatively rapidly and relatively accurately. As you can imagine, it's quite a complex picture trying to map out these trillions of different organisms. So science has moved on and allowed us to really look at that in some detail. And what we've then come to understand is just what that does for us, what this microbiome offers us. So we know that it's involved in digestion. So it actually survives by eating fiber, and what it does in the process is digests fiber for us. So fiber is something which you can only get from plants, and we cannot digest fiber without gut microbes doing it. So it helps us to digest various things. It also is involved in other digestive processes. It's also involved in producing some vitamins. But what we've really learned a lot more about recently is its role in immunity. So we know that it helps to shape our immunity when we're children. It also then is involved in some of our protective immune functions in terms of helping us to see off, pathological bugs that we come across. But on top of that, we know it's really now involved in the regulation and modulation of our immunity, and therefore it's really, really key in processes relating to things like allergies and autoimmune diseases. And we know now the role of immunity in terms of dampening inflammation, really, in almost all chronic diseases that we suffer. So we know that this inflammatory role and the modulation of inflammation is just so important for chronic diseases like heart disease and cancers and diabetes and almost, like I say, every chronic disease that we know about, arthritis. So we know that now. We know that actually we've got enough evidence now to show that a dysregulated gut microbiome, so an unhealthy one that's out of balance, is more linked with diseases such as inflammatory bowel disease, arthritis, diabetes.
And how does our gut microbiome change then as we go through the menopause transition?
So we know that when we reduce our amounts of estrogen, we have a reduction in our gut in the diversity of the gut microbiome. So in general, we want more diversity is healthier. And as we reduce the diversity of our gut microbiome, we have then more diseases coming from that. So we have a reduction in the diversity. We also have a shift in terms of the prevalence of certain bugs. So we tend to find that the more unhealthy bugs become more prevalent, and the less healthy, and the bugs that help us with our health more become less prevalent. On top of that, we know that the reduction in estrogen also means that our gut barrier, the permeability of our gut lining, is compromised, so that bacteria and toxins can cross from the gut into our blood. And again, that can drive this low-grade inflammation, which can then contribute to disease. What's also an important question is the flip side of that, which is not just how does the menopause impact our gut microbiome, but how does the gut microbiome impact our menopause? And we do know that there are various bacteria that we have down there that can help to recycle some of our hormones. So when we are getting rid of our hormones, we essentially put them into our gut and they're broken down and got rid of. But we do have certain bacteria that can help to break them down and then actually recycle them so that they are brought back into our system. So a healthy gut microbiome, we feel, can help to increase our estrogen levels and help offset our menopausal symptoms, even without actually literally producing more estrogen or replacing it through medicine.
And then look, and it's fantastic to be sharing this information, Anna, because it's clearly so important. But how would I know if my gut microbiome wasn't in balance, or if it needed some help? What would the symptoms be?
Sure. So they can be quite diverse because the impact of our gut microbiome is so diverse and so broad. What we can definitely get is some impacts on our gut health. So it's our gut symptoms. So we can get, for example, things like new food intolerances, bloating, more gas, change in bowel habits. So all those things can reflect the idea that we are struggling in a way to digest foods and to have our gut be as active as it was before. But on top of that, we know that the gut microbiome has a big impact on our mental health. So we can, for example, find that we can have reduced mood, reduced energy, reduced motivation. You can also have other physical symptoms, more skin rashes. So there's a real breadth of symptoms that can reflect the fact that your gut microbiome is actually a little bit out of balance, that we call, dysbiosis.
Thank you, Anna. That's really good to know. So now we know what the symptoms and the signs are that we could potentially look out for. And we've had great questions around what can we do to ensure that our gut microbiome is healthy, but it's clearly linked to what healthy eating looks like overall. And that's exactly what we're going to come to now, because all of these things are interlinked, aren't they? There's not one thing they're not separate solutions that we're looking for here. Claire, let's start off with your thoughts, as an expert in this area, and particularly with, the thousands of women in their 40s and 50s that you're helped as well. What advice can you give to keep our gut in balance and to help us with our weight management? And, you've given some great advice here about to somebody in the chat about lowering insulin resistance. So what would you recommend overall, Claire?
So the food changes that we can make that will help improve gut health will also help to lower insulin resistance, which is really important, and will also help us to lose weight. So they're very interconnected. There isn't one way of doing this. There are, there's different ways of eating that will suit different women. So it's very much about taking one or two of the things that we're talking about and trying to apply them to your own life. But the key thing from a gut health and a weight management perspective is to focus in on fiber. And there's a number of reasons for this. 95% of us are deficient in fiber. So the likelihood is that most of the people listening now are not going to be taking as much fiber as what our body needs. Ideally, we're wanting to aim for about 25 to 30 grams of fiber a day, and most of us are short by about 10 grams. And that can make a difference to our health, and it can make a difference to how we feel and the sorts of symptoms that Anna's just talked about. And the key is that fiber can do a huge amount for us in midlife as well. So if we give these gut bacteria the fiber that they love, they will then produce what are called short-chain fatty acids. And these short-chain fatty acids in the body do lots of fantastic things. One of the things they will do is they will help to lower insulin resistance. They help to lower cholesterol. They help to lower appetite and food cravings. And also they can increase the sort of motility within our gut. So it can stop the fiber can stop our gut from being quite so sluggish, which is something that can happen in menopause as well. So it keeps things moving, and that's important. And high fiber foods also are really rich in some of the micronutrients that we don't get from a lot of the highly processed foods that we are generally eating. So things like magnesium that can be really helpful. So high fiber foods definitely are something to really focus on. Where do we get that fiber from? Well, it comes from plant foods and different types of plant foods. Vegetables and fruits are really key. So we're looking for 5 portions of vegetables and 2 to 3 portions of fruit a day. That's the optimal. If you're nowhere near that at the moment, don't worry, just start where you are and gradually build up. It's not just the amount of vegetables and fruit and fiber either, it's the variety. So we want lots of different types of vegetables and fruits in there. You may have heard of the 30 different types of plant foods in a week as being a useful thing to aim for. And it's that diversity that really helps our gut microbiome to be well balanced. There are some vegetables and fruits that are higher in fiber than others. If people are interested in knowing which ones are higher in fiber, you can have a look on my Instagram bio, and I've got a nice free download there for you that you can see which foods have got 5 grams of fiber in them and how you can add those in. So vegetables and fruits definitely key. Whole grains, so things like wholemeal bread, whole wheat or lentil pasta, barley and oats, which can be really helpful for lowering cholesterol, or also other grains, things like quinoa and freekeh and amaranth, that can really add variety. And don't be afraid of putting those foods in. We need about 3 portions of whole grains a day, and they will lower insulin resistance, unlike refined carbohydrates and sugars that tend to increase it. Another great source of fiber is pulses. So anything like baked beans, chickpeas, lentils, butter beans, they will provide excellent amounts of fiber. So add those in where you can. And also nuts and seeds. Small handful of nuts every day will lower your risk of heart disease, but will also add in lots of extra fiber, as will seeds. So things like chia seeds, flax seeds, pumpkin seeds, again, sprinkle them on yogurt, put them on salad, really good sources of fiber. The thing to be aware of, though, when you're putting more fiber in is how you do it, because if you do it too quickly, you may increase the likelihood of bloating and side effects. So you need to do it really slowly if your fiber intake is low. So you're talking about maybe 1 extra vegetable serving a day, or maybe half a spoon of beans, or a teaspoon of seeds. So do it gradually. Make sure also that you're getting enough water in there as well, because fiber is like a sponge, and if you don't give it the fluid, it won't give you the benefits that you're looking for. And when you're increasing fiber, it can sometimes be quite helpful after a high fiber meal to go for a walk, to do a kind of 10-15 minute walk that gets the gut moving. And it can also kind of move along any trapped gas that's in there so that can help. And it will also help lower insulin resistance as well. So fiber is definitely the focus. From a weight point of view, we also need to be thinking about protein, and I'm sure people have seen lots of things online about menopause and protein, and we know that that is really important. If we are doing resistance training as a form of exercise, which is a really helpful thing to think about doing, then we need to make sure that we are getting enough protein to do the kind of repair of the muscle tissue. But also because when we add in enough protein, then that can help with controlling appetite. There has been, and if you've seen on social media, there are sometimes some crazy suggestions of the amounts of protein that we need. If you are taking 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram, that is enough for most women. If you're doing a very large amount of resistance training or you're doing an awful lot of exercise, you might need slightly more than that, maybe 1.5, 1.6, but I wouldn't go higher than that, because what you have to remember is if you're taking in too much protein, that will also be laid down as body fat. So it's getting the balance right. If you're looking for a sort of ballpark figure of how much protein, think about 1/4 of your plate as being the amount of protein to kind of try and take in. And the other thing with protein to think about, and this goes back to gut health, is about where we're getting the protein from, because most of our protein comes from animal sources. And it's really helpful to think maybe once or twice a week, could we go for a vegetable source of protein? So something like beans and pulses, or some of the soya-based things that we can buy, things like tofu and tempeh. And what's helpful about those is that they combine both protein and fiber together. So you're sort of doing both of the things at the same time. So yeah, think about maybe adding in a vegetable source of protein as a sort of strategy.
Claire,
Healthy.
we're getting lots of great questions coming in, and I'm not sure if you can see them in the chat, and some of them so I thought might be useful as we're talking about protein, and you've just spoken about fiber. There's some great questions in here about fiber and about portion size, which I think would be helpful to cover for protein as well. There was a great question around fiber. Can you eat too much fiber? You've already covered the pace of, managing the pace with which you introduce it, but can too much fiber be detrimental for one's health?
I think there are certainly examples of people eating up to 50 grams of fiber a day and being absolutely fine. I mean, I think it's how much you can tolerate. So I wouldn't be overly concerned about taking in too much, as long as it doesn't mean that you're not getting in other foods that you need. So as long as you're getting in your protein as well as your fiber, then I think that's okay. But it's really about the pace at which you put it in. For most people, the risk is not too much, it's too little.
Yeah, good. Thank you for that. And then somebody else has just mentioned, very sorry to hear that you've IBS and they can't tolerate natural high fiber. Do you have anything that you could recommend for them in terms of anything else they can do or take?
I mean, with IBS, it's really about looking sometimes at the types of fibers. So there are fermentable, what are called fermentable carbohydrates. So with IBS, there are some types of carbohydrates that they will maybe struggle with more than others. It's difficult to be specific without knowing the individual person. So I think it's looking maybe, at some IBS websites and trying to, if that person wants some IBS dietitians, I can certainly recommend, but it's quite difficult to give specific recommendations about the sorts of foods that they're definitely going to be able to tolerate. I mean, I don't know, they may have already got some ideas about which ones of those foods are problematic and which ones are not. There are certainly some vegetables and some fruits that may cause fewer problems. So I would have a look maybe at the Monash website, they've got some lists of vegetables and fruits and other carbohydrate foods that are lower in fermentable carbohydrates.
Brilliant, thank you. And maybe when we have a moment later, Claire, if you could put that Monash link into the chat,
Sure.
that would be super. That would be really helpful. And I'll share that in an email that we'll send around with a link to the video as well. But one of the things you touched on there, Claire, was fermented foods. So again, seem to be very much kind of in the news, and you know, with kombucha and kimchi and everything. So tell us some more about fermented foods and their benefits.
Yeah, so fermented foods, for anyone who's not familiar with them, it's foods that actually have live bacteria in them. So it'll be things like live yogurt and kefir and kombucha, and kimchi. And those sorts of foods can be helpful because they've got some of these beneficial bacteria in that can get down to your gut. So again, you know, I wouldn't introduce those foods if you're not familiar with them. I wouldn't introduce them quickly. I would add them in slowly. But yes, that's certainly something that we can think about putting in. And if we can build up so that we're taking those sorts of foods daily, then that can be helpful for our gut health.
Thank you. So it's just more choices, isn't it?
Yeah.
In terms of what's available. And Anna, I know when we've spoken before about gut health and, you know, getting to the 30 plant points a week can feel overwhelming, but actually you've given some great advice around, you know, when you break it down and think about spices and other things. So how do you go from feeling, wow, I'll never manage 30 plants in a week, to actually showing people that it is doable?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I think, yeah, it's thinking about those plants, and you know, my immediate thought when I first heard about plants was fruits and vegetables, which obviously is hugely important. But for one thing, to think that every different color is a different entity. So, you know, a green, red, orange, and white, you know, yellow pepper are all different in that sense. So it doesn't mean that you have to be necessarily thinking massively outside the box. You can just sort of increase diversity even within things you already eat. And then just making sure that you think about the fact that nuts and seeds, herbs and spices, and then obviously grains and are also part of that. So, you know, simple things like adding a little bit of cinnamon to porridge or to yogurt or to a pudding. You know, if you have toast and some avocado, then you know you could put some cumin on that, or you know there are quite a lot of different ways that you can sort of just start to incorporate more breadth, more diversity from this whole, you know, world of plants into your diet. And you know, again, nuts and seeds are such an easy one to add to add something. So if you get some, you know, mixed nuts and mixed seeds, and you have something like yogurt in the morning, you put some fruit, you put some of the mixed seeds and mixed nuts, and then maybe a bit of cinnamon on top, you can literally have, within that one bowl of food in the morning, you can have 15 different plants. And that just means that even if that is something which, you know, is your staple in the morning, and you almost feel like you've had a good start, so then you can think about you know, the other meals, but it feels the pressure's off a little bit, then you know, sometimes it's just thinking about quick ways to just get that diversity increased.
Yeah, fantastic, and really practical advice. And I've also posted a link into the chat of a brilliant, so Anna's article, and also a brilliant article that Claire wrote for us. And one of the things I love about that article, Claire, is that you've given practical advice and an example of meal plans that people can use as well. And there's a link to Claire's brilliant website as well. So if you want to get in touch with her as well, just speak to her individually, you can reach her there as well. That information is in there. Now, I know there's other thoughts and advice that you have around things that we can do to keep our gut in balance and to help us manage our weight. Let's talk about fats, because not all fats are equal, are they? Claire, should we start with you and share your thoughts on fats and help us to understand more about healthy fats?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we're trying to manage weight, I think sometimes we can be a little bit concerned about introducing fats because we're concerned that obviously they have calories and that's going to lead to weight gain. But there is a difference between saturated fats and unsaturated fats in terms of how our body responds to them. So it is important to move away from saturated fats, things like butter and fatty meats, towards those unsaturated sources. So things like using extra virgin olive oil on salads or to cook with, including avocado, including things like nuts and seeds. And we know that these unsaturated fats can really help in terms of lowering insulin resistance again. So that's why they are important to include. And I think, one of the other areas to maybe just flag up while we're talking about healthy fats is to think about oily fish, because the sorts of fats that we will get in oily fish they're called omega-3 fats, and those again are really important in terms of heart health and gut health and lowering insulin resistance. So trying to include 2 portions of fish a week, ideally one of those is oily fish. And when we say oily fish, we mean things like anchovies and salmon and sardines and mackerel. So yeah, including those where we can. If somebody is vegetarian or vegan, then or maybe doesn't like fish, then you can include things like walnuts and seeds that will have a version of omega-3 that they're not quite as good as oily fish. And if you don't include any of those things, then perhaps an omega-3 supplement might be something that's worth considering.
Okay, thank you, Claire. That's clear. And you've answered somebody's question here. I hope somebody asked a question around how to lower insulin resistance. So I think you've touched on some of the foods, that we can eat and add to our diet to help us lower our insulin resistance. So that was super helpful, just to have that distinction between healthy and unhealthy fats. You've touched on hydration. Anything else that Anna, you might want to say, or Claire, you might want to say about hydration and the importance of drinking enough water?
Yeah, I mean, I feel, as Claire had mentioned before, that obviously if you're increasing your fibre, it's really important to at the same time increase your fluids. It's important full stop anyway. There are people who I see all the time with other issues relating to dehydration, headaches, constipation, urine infection. So I think it's a good health health habit to have anyway, but I think it's certainly important when it comes to your gut health. And I think it's also important to think about water in the context of drinks as a whole, really, and making sure that, ideally clear fluids, and then a couple of select other drinks, maybe tea and coffee, without sugar, without too much milk, are really making up most of what we're drinking. So we're trying to factor out there the fruit juices, the fizzy drinks, and other drinks. A lot of people will drink barely any water, to be honest, or and we'll drink lots of other fluids. So I think water, one, is a really important thing, but then it's also thinking about drinks as a whole. When you think about tackling your diet, I almost feel drinks is often the first thing I look at. It can be such a source of empty calories and actually quite a lot of negative things, chemicals, caffeine, etc. So I think it's always worthwhile thinking about your fluids as a big group.
So how much water would you recommend, or what range would you recommend that we aim to drink every day?
I mean, I would say generally around about 1.5 to 2 litres. I think obviously if you're doing extreme amounts of exercise, then that might want to increase. Obviously to an extent, if you're an incredibly sort of small physique and small person, you might get away with a bit less. But in general, if you're drinking around about 2 litres of clear fluids a day, then you can't go too far wrong. I would be mindful of sometimes of front loading that at the start of the day. So I often talk to women about trying to get in at least sort of 1 litre, 1.5 litres before lunch, so that they're then not actually then feeling thirst and drinking a lot of their fluids, or realizing, oh, I haven't drunk hardly any of my 2 litre bottle that I've got to remind me, and then they get to 7 o'clock at night and drink 1.5 litres, and then that's really impacting on their sleep with getting up for the toilet. And so I think that's what I'd aim for, but I do think it's important to have it as part of that morning routine to try and front load.
Thank you. Very practical advice there. Now we've touched on it a little, but can you share your thoughts on alcohol and how you think about alcohol, especially in midlife? And I know you touched on empty calories, which sadly I think alcohol counts as. But what are your advice or guidance, or what are the things for us to think about when it comes to alcohol consumption?
Do you want me to take that, Claire?
I can take that.
Okay.
So alcohol, we know that as we go through menopause, our bodies tend to process alcohol differently. We're not quite as effective as what we used to be, so it affects us quicker and it takes us longer to recover. In terms of managing weight, it can have quite a big effect because of the calorie content of it, but also because it affects sleep in quite a significant way. And we know that sleep is something that is very closely connected with struggling with weight. If your sleep is adversely affected, then it makes managing weight more difficult. So I think and also the other thing in terms of gut health is that alcohol can have an adverse effect on the gut microbiome as well. So I think it's certainly worth thinking about if you're taking more than maybe one alcoholic drink a day, is maybe thinking, is this something that I need to tweak a little bit? It's not saying that you can't drink alcohol and you have to go teetotal, but it's thinking, is this something that, needs a little bit of adjustment?
Yes, Annie, I know. I found as well, and I hear this a lot from friends, that alcohol intolerance, or more headaches, more almost side effects from alcohol as we go through the menopause transition, as well. So, any other thoughts on alcohol and alcohol consumption at this stage in life?
So I think, as Claire touched on, we know that alcohol essentially for our gut microbiome is a toxin. So we know it has an impact on, affecting diversity and the healthy bugs there. I think also from a more generalized perspective at this point, we're obviously thinking about some diseases become, I suppose, more at the forefront of our minds, and I think breast cancer being one of them. And we know that drinking more than 2 units of alcohol per day, so more than 14 units, which obviously is just on the cusp of that national guidance limit, does increase our risk of breast cancer actually by more than combined HRT. So I think it's just being mindful of the fact that actually we don't need to necessarily be drinking what people might perceive to be really excessive amounts here to have an impact on our risk of lots of different diseases, breast cancer being one of them, but also other cancers and heart disease and various other things. So I think it absolutely has a role in a direct way in terms of sleep and our gut microbiome, but then also that chronic disease impact becomes maybe more relevant.
Yeah, and I should just a signpost, we've got a couple of great articles that we'll be publishing about alcohol and its impact on the body, but also just some practical advice on alternatives, non-alcoholic alternatives and things that you can do to help you manage your alcohol consumption if it's problematic in terms of the health impact that you're experiencing. So they'll be published in July, in a few weeks' time. So if you sign up to our newsletter, you will signpost to them as part of that. Now, unbelievably, we've only got 11 minutes left. The 50 minutes has gone really quickly, and we could obviously talk for a lot longer. There's a few things that I'd love to cover in the last few minutes of our webinar. It would be fantastic to hear from you both about ultra processed foods. So one, very quickly, what they are, how they impact us, and some practical advice on swaps. So Claire, if you could just maybe start off with that. And there's a really, really important question that I do want to come to. Somebody emailed this to us in advance, and it's come up a few times in the chat as well. So I want to make sure we have a couple of minutes at the end to deal with that question. But ultra processed foods, or UPFs, again, hearing a lot about them in the press. What on earth are they, and what's the impact that they have on us?
So ultra-processed foods are those that are created by the food industry and that have multiple additives in them. So they have emulsifiers and sweeteners and those things that when you look on the back of the packet, you don't really know what they are, and you certainly wouldn't have them in your kitchen. We don't have a brilliant system at the moment for looking at ultra-processed foods, in the sense that it's just looking at processing. It's not looking at the nutritional quality of the food. So you have a lot of variations within the same group. So you can have like a fizzy drink would be classified as ultra processed, but for example, some supermarket wholemeal bread would be classified as ultra processed, whereas clearly they are nutritionally very different. So I think it's important for us to focus in on those ultra processed foods that we think are probably causing the most issues. We know that they drive us to overeat, probably by around about 500 calories extra per day when they've done research of people taking entirely ultra-processed or entirely minimally processed. So they're definitely driving us to want to eat more. That's probably to do with how concentrated in calories they are, but also because they hit something called your bliss point, which is this combination of fats and sugars and salts that when you eat these foods, it sort of lights up the reward centers in your brain and just makes you want to keep going. And they're also foods that they've got this very sort of meltable texture, so we eat them really, really quickly. And that's probably involved as well. So I think in terms of those foods within the ultra-processed food group to focus in on, we've mentioned already sugary drinks. Sugary fizzy drinks are definitely one to swap out for water or tea or coffee, herbal teas, those sorts of things. I think processed meats we know are not ideal in terms of gut health. So swapping those for like tinned fish, cottage cheese, tofu, tempeh, beans, pulses, and then ultra-processed snack foods, which I think are where lots of people are getting a lot of the fat and the sugar in their diets from. So it's thinking, can I swap those to sort of whole food alternatives? So things like nuts, olives, popcorn, oatcakes and hummus or tzatziki, those, or Greek yogurt and berries, those kind of whole food snacks that I think can sort of be helpful in terms of managing weight, but also improving gut health.
Thank you. Look, that's really great practical advice, Claire, because what we're doing has to be doable as well. It has to be realistic and affordable for people as well. And I think you've just given some brilliant pragmatic advice, and your article goes into that as well.
And I think the more that if people do have the time and the energy, and the more they can cook, then obviously that's better. The more you're preparing food yourself, the more control you've got. But I think you're right. It's about the balance between what is practical.
And Anna, any other, because I know you've written about this in your gut microbiome article, just in terms of the impact of UPFs on our gut microbiome as well. Any other thoughts from you before we come to some of the questions?
Absolutely, like you say, we do know that they have a large impact on our gut microbiome. I think something which I've sort of research is showing us is an 80-20 rule. So, in an ideal world, we would obviously want everyone to avoid UPFs at all costs. And I think that's a good thing to sort of aim towards. But equally, we all have times when we go somewhere and we can't control what we're eating, or we're in a rush, or, we're on holiday and we don't want to feel that maybe if we've worked really hard to do things, we're then undoing it very quickly and almost not being able to relax when actually we really should be in terms of socializing with food. So I think, it's good to try and get our home food and our regular meals to be ideally as, getting rid of UPF as much as possible. But if we can then do that, then we can sort of, like I say, if 80% of the time we're trying to avoid UPFs, then we feel that we can compensate about 20% much better. We gain some resilience in our gut microbiome, tolerating that to some extent. So I think it's sort of feeling that, do your best, but it doesn't have to be all or nothing. A little bit like Claire was saying earlier in terms of modest weight gain, modest change to our diet is going to still have a really profound impact, rather than thinking, gosh, I can't cut all that out, so I won't cut anything out.
Yeah, excellent. Yes, small steps, baby steps, every little step that's taking us, in the right direction is going to make a difference. So we had a great question about the vaginal microbiome. So Anna and Joe Bailey, consultant gynecologist, did an excellent webinar in April on the vaginal and gut microbiome. So I posted a link about that in the chat. So last couple of questions. So one really interesting one. Do you have any recommendations on the amount of caffeine that we consume, be that coffee or tea, and also the type of caffeine? And I would ask the type because I've converted to matcha, become a massive matcha fan. And does that make, I'm telling myself it's a better type of caffeine, but is it? Or am I a sucker for the marketing?
I was just trying to answer that question, and I was just typing away, so that was really helpful. The 400 milligrams of caffeine a day is what is.
Sorry, how much is that, Claire, in cups?
Yeah, so it's kind of it's about 4 cups. It depends on the type of coffee and the size of your coffee. And I've got a blog on my website, actually. I've just written all about caffeine. So if anybody wants to have a look at it.
Put the link in the chat and we'll send it around, Claire. That would be great.
Put the link in. Yeah, there's some, I mean, I think that with caffeine, it's also the timing of it that's important because of its potential impact on sleep. I mean, we're very different in terms of how we respond to caffeine. But if you take caffeine now, then in 5 hours' time, 50% of it will still be in your body. So you can see how, the timing can make quite a big difference. So I would say if you're struggling with sleep, then probably stopping around about midday and swapping to decaf. There's lots of really beneficial, because when we're thinking about coffee, we have to separate out the caffeine bit from the plant part of the coffee. So there's lots of polyphenols and actually fiber in coffee that is really beneficial. So it's not necessarily that it's something we need to remove completely, but maybe the timing of it is important, and maybe swapping to decaf is an option in the afternoon.
Yeah, that morning cup of coffee is so enjoyable. But yes, so it's getting a lot of reactions to the caffeine and the alcohol point. So thank you. So look, the question that I wanted to come back to, and apologies, we've gotten to most questions, but apologies to anyone whose question we didn't get to. But this question came in advance, and it's thematically come through here again, where somebody said, they really feel that they've tried all of this. They have, I'm just scrolling up here to look for it. They're still putting weight on in their middle. They've tried changing their diet. They've tried, managing portions and everything, but they're still struggling. So, and I think we can all relate to that, and we've all been there. So, Claire, one of the things I was struck by in the event that we did with you in January, you spoke about the psychology of how we think about food and how we approach it, and then how in reframing it. So what advice would you give to somebody who's just feels that they've tried everything and is still struggling to manage their weight?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they're not alone, because there's quite a few comments like that, isn't there? And I think, obviously it is challenging, but knowing the kind of the what side of it is important. So knowing the sorts of things that we've been talking about, the quantities, the amounts of food, the balance of food is important. But sometimes it is about the why. Sometimes it's not just about what we're eating, sometimes it's about why. And, that's going back to the kind of emotional eating side of it. So is it that in some instances we might be using food as a way of coping when we're tired or we're stressed? That might not be part of it, but for some people, I think that it is. But I think it is also the looking at the broader elements as well, looking at stress and sleep and physical activity. I mean, we haven't really talked about activity much, but resistance training is something that is incredibly important when we're thinking about managing weight. And I think it's also about how we develop habits, that when we're thinking about making food changes, it's looking at mindset, because that can be really important. What do we believe about ourselves and our ability to change? Are we telling ourselves things that maybe aren't that helpful? And that can be quite a common thing. So, it's looking at mindset, it's looking at how we establish habits. So not trying to do a complete overhaul of our diet, but, taking it small step at a time, not waiting for motivation to start making changes, but taking tiny little actions and then building on those as our motivation and our momentum builds. So I think it's kind of looking at mindset and how we form habits as well. That's really key.
Brilliant. Thank you, Claire. And Anna, any closing thoughts from you before we wrap things up, and I hand back to Aideen?
I think that everyone everyone was obviously very individual, so their journey through that is going to be incredibly individual. But I think it's just, I don't want to open a can of worms just before we finish, but I think also the time of your eating in terms of how you distribute your food through the day, and then what window within which you eat your food. So I think there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest now that time restricted eating to some extent can be beneficial for most people. And it, for one thing, it also gives your gut microbiome rest, so it gives them time to actually essentially clean and maintain the lining of the gut. And in general, the consensus seems to be that if you can eat within 10 hours in any given day, then that's ideal, but sort of 12 hours is also still a good rule of thumb. So I think it is just giving mind to the fact that it's not simply as well what you're eating, it's also how you eat it. You know, the timings around that. Late night snacks are sort of rife for gaining weight, hot flushes within the, you know, so the timing is also something to give some thought.
Yeah, so look, you've shared with us your expertise. You've both given us some brilliant practical advice and tips as well, and that's what I love about it. It's really doable. So before I head back to Aideen, a big thank you. I know you've both had busy days in the clinic and seeing patients, and really appreciate you giving of your time so generously to us this evening to share your experience and your expertise. Thank you very much. Aideen, back to you.
Thanks a million, Helen. That was a great event. So yes, huge thanks to Dr. Anna Greaves and Claire Grace for this evening. Amazing help and support and advice. And thanks to everyone who's joined us this evening too, and for all your amazing questions. I'm sure you found it very helpful, as I did. So following the event, you'll receive a link to the recording to reshare or to watch again. Good night, everyone, and thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your evenings. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Aideen. Bye, everyone. Bye, Anna. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.